All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the work session of the Finance Executive Committee to discuss charter amendments to the Office of Inspector General. I'm Alex Wan. I'm joined by my colleagues to my left, regrettably, Howard Shook, and to my right, Council President Doug Shipman. I suspect we may have more council members joining us as the session progresses. But we're basically here to discuss a piece of legislation that's being held in Finance Executive Committee, 22-01823, which initially was brought forward to essentially separate the Ethics Office from the Office of Inspector General. But as we've been discussing in Finance Executive Committee, the Office of Inspector General has come forward with some proposed changes as well, and we're of the ilk that if we're going to open this up, let's go ahead and make all the changes at one time so that it's done comprehensively and out of respect for the work and thought that went into the creation of the Office of Inspector General during the previous term. Also joined by my colleague Jason Winston. So the flow of the work session today is going to be, we're going to hear from Jabu Sangova, the Ethics Officer, specifically to the proposals that are included in the legislation. When she's finished, we'll take questions for her after that, and then we'll hear from the Office of Inspector General, as well as the board, from the Inspector General herself and the board chair, and then we can go into discussion. We will have public comment at the end, and then we'll determine our next steps after that. Any other comments or questions before we get started? Okay, with that, I'll go ahead and invite Ms. Sangova to come up. Oh, wow, here comes the mics. Here we go. All right, live and in color. So let me go ahead and invite Ms. Sangova to come up to the podium, and you're up. Colleagues, she does have a presentation. We have a printed copy in materials. Sangova, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Try to keep this as concise as possible. So, good morning, Chair Wan, Council President, and members of the committee. Again, my name is Jabu Sangova, and I currently serve as the Ethics Officer for the Ethics Division. Thank you for allowing me to speak on this proposed paper, and I did speak about this several months ago, if you recall. First, I did want to state again, which I did say on the record a few months ago, that the Ethics Division has always been in support in the creation of the Office of Inspector General. And in fact, my office did heavily support and assist with the setup of the new office. I think it's clear for us to make sure that we do fully support the Inspector General office. However, we have operated under the existing structure for a few years, and we believe that this change is necessary to preserve the independence of the ethics function. All right, let's started.
And we're also joined by Councilmember Marcy Collier-Overstreet.
All right, for the benefit of the people watching, just really briefly, as far as the ethics function, the ethics officer reports to a 9-member citizen board. Members are nominated by, of course, legal, business, civic, and accounting, certified fraud examiners, and educational organizations. And our board chair is present here today, Ms. Nicola Hines. We are currently an 11-person office, and just quickly, we provide, of course, ethics training, give advice on conflicts of interest and gift rules, investigate ethics complaints, manage the financial disclosure process, and we maintain the ethics and compliance hotline. These are just some of the areas that that the code covers. I'm not going to go to each one of them, but for example, gifts and gratuities, conflicts of interest, use of city property, financial disclosure. Moving on. Now, in our program, pretty much just follows what we call under the federal sentencing guidelines, which are 7 steps for effective ethics program. Tell the rules, which means we provide ethics advice, assign high-level independent personnel to oversee the ethics program, which is what the ethics officer should be, train and educate, audit and monitor, discipline violators, and fix problems. So our program kind of, follows Yes.
I'm saying if you back up from the mic a little bit, the Ps, for some reason, are really what causes the,
Okay. That better?
Yeah, that'd
Okay,
be.
sorry about that. All right, so our program pretty much just follows the standard steps for an effective ethics program. All right, I'll get right to the heart of why we are here today, which is request a charter amendment pursuant to 2201A23, and that is the separation of the ethics function from the IG function. All right, and I did talk about this before, and the independence of the ethics office is critical. Why is it critical? In other words, the ethics office must be a fully independent and autonomous office. We believe that the current structure does interfere with the independence of ethics because while it may, the structure was designed, and we do understand that it was designed for the ethics office to have a degree of autonomy in terms of separate division, our budget and staff, and as well as the ethics officer being appointed by the governing board, the code does say expressly that the IG leads and heads the Office of Inspector General. Further, the current structure does not prevent the IG office from investigating matters that could be under the jurisdiction of ethics. Further, the IG function should not serve as a gatekeeper over the ethics function because the current law states that the ethics officer must give the IG prior notice of any investigation, and likewise give the IG prior notice of the conclusion of an investigation. However, there is no similar provision required that the IG notify the ethics office of its investigations. So, for instance, what if the ethics office was investigating employees in the IG office? Would the ethics office be required to give notice to the IG? We do believe that this provision is problematic and basically serves as a gatekeeper over the ethics function. The next point would be in terms of the regulatory and advisory function of ethics, and that it must be independent from any city office, including the Inspector General. Ethics must be independent from the broad investigatory authority of the IG. For example, there could be potential issues that arise where ethics may be advising an official or employee, and the IG could be investigating that official employee. Rightfully so, the IG does not have the duty to inform ethics, but that could be problematic in terms of our function. And we do believe that the public trust does rest in a truly and independent autonomous ethics function, and ethics must remain operationally independent from operations and investigations into potential criminal liability and matters that are under the jurisdiction of the IG. For 20 years, we have been the standard for best ethics offices in the country, and we just want to continue to, with that standard and being fully in charge of our investigative and advisory duties. And it's also critical that we retain our investigative authority based on the level of expertise that we have gathered over the years. The next issue, which is also pretty critical, is the potential for conflicts. Now, it is conceivable, based on the authority that's given to the IG, that the IG may investigate ethics as well as vice versa, given the fact that we do have separate functions. And any investigation of either office should not arise out of any political influence. And we do believe that by having the two offices housed under one umbrella creates potential conflicts because there is the ability of each office to investigate each other. And the two functions should be separated by that very reason, being that either could investigate each other. The next would be in terms of budgetary and administrative challenges in terms of our budget and personnel-related transactions. Internally, we have, in the past few years, with all fairness, we have worked with the departments of Department of Human Resources, Finance, and Procurement to try to resolve these matters as best as we can. However, we still have experienced challenges in terms of budget and operational. In terms of some of the expenses we've experienced, being more specific, for example, our quarterly reporting of expenses have been tedious and difficult. At times, invoices have been coded incorrectly and often expensed to the wrong budget. Hiring and onboarding processes have been inadvertently commingled. Processing and approval of transactions have also been commingled, often leading to delays. So really not by any fault of anyone, but due to the structure, the combined budgets have created some of these challenges. And so it is our position that separation is warranted, which would ensure operational efficiency for both offices. Let's see, yeah. So just really quick, just kind of finishing up. This next chart just shows the jurisdictional authority of each, really, I guess, oversight office. And as you see that in terms of ethics, our jurisdiction, in terms of the IG compliance function, that jurisdiction, and of course, the audit function. And the reason I bring that up is that I do not want the council to think that there would not be continued coordination and collaboration between both offices. We believe that defined duties and responsibilities will provide clarity on the jurisdiction of each office. We can establish standard procedures and guidance for the officials and employees to minimize any confusion and overlap of responsibilities, which we're clear about, and just continue to engage, which we already do, in joint review investigations to strengthen coordination and collaboration. So, final thoughts. The positioning of the Ethics Office as an independent charter city office simply builds on the hard work for the past 4 years to strengthen the city's independent oversight and reaffirm the city's commitment to further establishing a culture of ethics. We want to make sure we say that this proposed paper does not negate any of the time and effort that was invested to create the Office of Inspector General or even the current work of the city's IG. We believe that each office has a critical yet operational and jurisdictionally different role to play in sustaining the culture of compliance and ethics which we aspire. Each office plays an important role in supporting the city's position as a great place to do business and build public confidence in our day-to-day decisions. Further, we believe that the paper will remove any confusion for the public as well as for our officials and employees as to which office performs each function. Finally, it is critical that the City of Atlanta has an entirely independent and autonomous ethics function, not one that is structured under another office. A horizontal structure in which all three functions, IG, ethics, and audit, are co-partners without eroding any current levels of independence, which we believe best serves the citizens of Atlanta. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sangova. And we're also joined by Councilmember Dozier. All right, I'm going to enter. Does anybody have questions? I have a whole slew of them, but I'll defer to my colleagues. Yeah, Ms. Collier Overstreet, you have the floor.
So, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I have more comments than
Please.
a question.
Yep.
I actually was the author of the Public Trust Task Force that we put together in, I can't remember what year now, before COVID, BC. That was the basis of the recommendations that were given for us to maintain or to recapture the public trust of our constituents and our residents. And that's where the recommendation for the IG department was formed. And from there, Councilmember Ide and Councilmember Shook and myself went through rigorous meetings, extensive for weeks, along with the law department. Thank you so much, Amber. Ms. Robinson was instrumental in making sure that we had an ironclad IG department. So it was never a document that we thought would be the only way to do it. Never. But we did know that what we put together could stand the test of time, and that it would definitely be an addition to the city that was something that we truly needed. We were sure about that because we used about 1 million different scenarios to make sure that we didn't have any loopholes or needed to fix anything. That being said, when this legislation came up in December, I was very open to see where are we now, because it's been a moment, maybe a year, that we've had the new installation of the IG, and I know that, again, it's not a perfect document, and there are options that we could explore in order to make it even better for the city. And I met with all of you because we took time with this paper, the one that's currently before us, to make sure that it wouldn't weaken our legislation and that it would be better in the long run for the legislation. And I have really looked into what you've asked, and there are just a few things that stand out to me, other than the fact that I'm very clear that this will not weaken the IG department for ethics to stand alone. I do know that during our process of writing it, we definitely thought about ethics standing alone, but we didn't think that it would be a way to move forward with the paper for everyone on the outside looking in, for it to be a paper that they would be able to palate, if we're being completely transparent. And we wanted to make sure that there were going to be we wanted it to be strong and fair to everyone. So that's where we landed. I do believe that the argument that you're making is very valid. I definitely think that the IG office should not be your gatekeeper, the gatekeeper of the ethics office. I think that puts us in a place now, once we adopt this legislation, because I'm going to support it. Once we adopt the legislation, that it will put us in a place of trying something new to strengthen it even further. And I'm fine with that, because I have spoken to many people that has assured me that it'll be fine. It's not going to weaken our IG department. So I'm fine with that. And finally, I do believe that public trust has been restored in the city of Atlanta to a place where it wasn't in 2018 when I first took office. And we can continue to monitor the situation as we, change what we need to change in that new in the new department. So I'm going to support it. Just letting you know that. Just had comments. I really have done a lot of studying on this, and I don't really have a lot of questions that I've not already asked.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Chair
Do you
Wong.
want to respond to that, or?
No, thank you
Okay.
for that. Thank you. And I agree that, because I did want to make it clear that if we didn't support the office, we wouldn't have done the work to get it started. That's just being transparent. So, yes.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to say, I'm really glad that when you walked in and Mr. Shook walked in, because I think there's a lot of institutional history in terms of the evolution and genesis of this process that's going to be helpful for those of us that are new to understand why that structure was set up, and then what the potential benefits and consequences, quite frankly, that will be. So I'm going to turn over to Mr. Shipman. Anybody else want to after him before I launch my questions? Okay.
Thank you. Actually, working off that last comment from Councilmember Wan, I am curious if Councilmember Overstreet or Shook would want to comment briefly on why the setup was this way in the initial legislation, in that the ethics office was a part of the IG. Can you give us any context?
Well, speaking for myself, my notion was that combining them, having them interact, as closely as possible, was just a nod to a perceived and assumed efficiency. Turns out, there were some drawbacks too, that we had not had an opportunity to reflect on. I just thought it would be more efficient. I mean, these organizations are, likely partners in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I will agree with that. I definitely saw where they would work together for the common good. But at the same time, I know that once you start pulling different departments and different portions out of the umbrella, that everyone would want to be pulled out. Oh, I don't want to, not me, took me out. And that makes it not work. Whereas having them in made it work. That allowed us to begin our new IG. And so we just made sure that we had a good start. That's what it was about.
It's helpful, and it makes sense. Just two quick reflections. One, when this first came up, I actually went to the Georgia Municipal Association and had some conversations and had them do some research on other jurisdictions around this question. And there are many, many jurisdictions that actually separate them into two different offices. I think that's a pretty consistent move that we see across the country. I've reflected a lot, and also there was a mix in that data from other cities as to whether or not it was one board or two. I think that's sort of an interesting question. And I think to the comments that both Councilmember Overstreet and Councilmember Shook made, I actually think one board still makes sense, because I think given how much overlap there is between ethics and IG, to have at least one spot in the structure in which all of those questions resolve in one place, right, on one board, to say, okay, maybe we need to change exactly the lines here, maybe we've seen a process flow that doesn't quite work. I actually think maintaining one board for two offices is in fact a pretty wise move, and is something that we do see in other jurisdictions. And so you, in essence, you still have the kind of deconflicting oversight through one board, but you do, I think, potentially get some of the advantages of having the offices separate. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you, Council President. I also want to acknowledge we've been given a copy of the report of the Task Force for Promotion of Public Trust, and on page 9, it does, the recommended structure did come out of that. So I don't think it was necessarily drawn from thin air, but was something that they had looked into. My question, I'm going to poke a little bit, because I want to make sure my litmus test on this is, are we doing this because it's good policy, or are we doing it just to make things easier? Because I want to make sure that that's the basis of the decision. You mentioned in here a couple of things. For example, on slide 6, current structure interferes with the independence of the ethics office. Do you have specific examples of that? You said a couple of times you did say potential or could. I'm curious as to if there are specific instances where there's been friction because of something y'all were trying to do, or and then also, how much of it is real versus how much of it is perceived because of the way y'all are interpreting the structure versus actual operation.
Thank you, Chairman. No, I would say definitely this is definitely a policy. It's not making things easier. As far as saying that if there's anything specifically, we've looked at in terms of the current structure, and again, mentioned the fact about we should not have a gatekeeper over our function. And as it stands right now, I talked about the issue of having to provide prior notice of an investigation by ethics. What again if an employee in the IG office was under investigation? By no means has that happened, let me be clear.
Yeah.
But that is, removing myself from this role. I'm not going to be in this role forever, but we're talking about if you really want to have an independent ethics function, that provision is problematic. And it does really dilute the independence of the office. Again, also, in terms of, I talked about the advisory and regulatory function. We could be, we do a lot of advice. We could be advising an official employee that may be under investigation. That I just should not have any duty to notify of that, but we're all under the same umbrella.
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So would removing that provision of notification or adding a reciprocation, does that solve it?
I don't believe so.
Okay, all right. And then the other piece, in the 2 years that this has been in operation, you said could, having the IGB gatekeeper could be problematic. Has there been a specific instance where it's been created a problem?
There have been some instances, not by any fault, but just the current structure, yeah.
Okay, so there have been, can you be more specific without revealing the nature of the cases?
In terms of just some investigations.
Yeah, I want to make sure we are understanding the symptoms versus the real symptoms that y'all have experienced over the last 2 years versus this perception or anticipation of a phantom possibility. I want to solve those problems first and then look at, okay, what could also potentially happen and make sure we're being comprehensive about our approach. You know my style. I don't like to necessarily, this could happen, so let's make this radical change just in case. I want to, if something has happened, let's address that, and then hopefully that solution also addresses the potential opportunity going forward.
I think there's an opportunity for collaboration and coordination so these things don't happen. But there have been some instances because of the structure. The IG function is different from the ethics function.
I want to drill down into that. There have been some instances. Tell me. I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand to make sure the solution that's being proposed addresses your experience already and the problems you've encountered versus the anticipation of issues.
I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question, sorry.
Give me an example. Give me a very specific example. I was in this situation where someone came to me and I realized because of the structure of being under OIG, I could not do X, Y, or Z. Or if I did X, Y, or Z, it would conflict with the structure. I'm just trying to
Right,
dive into
understand.
that.
Well, I would say in terms of being able to investigate each other, for example. So if there was a complaint that was actually made against the ethics office, and the IG had a duty to investigate and not to report it to us. That's problematic because we're under the same umbrella.
Okay, but yeah, I guess I'm struggling with that a little bit because just because you're under the same structure doesn't necessarily, you've got the authority to do the investigations, vice versa, right? You're just concerned about a kind of a political and authority conflict, but there's nothing provisionally that states you can't do X, Y, or Z, right? And maybe this is a law question. I don't know.
Amber A. Robinson, City of Atlanta Department of Law. I mean, I think if you were to set forth what you mean by X, Y, and Z, maybe I could advise as to whether or not the ethics office would be permitted to do it.
Slide 8. The two functions must be separate as the ability to investigate each other creates potential conflicts. Well, right now, each one of them, by law, by code, has the authority to investigate, and they could investigate each other. It's just a concern about the reporting structure that is creating the potential friction, right? I mean, there's nothing that prevents them from investigating each other right now.
There's nothing in the current charter which would prevent each office from investigating each other in accordance with their own jurisdiction as set forth in the charter.
But the concern, which is very real, is the fact that because of the reporting structure, there's a hesitance created naturally by that to launch an investigation up the food chain, correct?
Yes, you wouldn't want to have two offices under the same umbrella investigating each other. I think that would be a deterrence to anyone in my position, and I don't think that's
Under the same umbrella. Now, we're saying that we're going to keep y'all under the same board, but just move you structurally out of the office. But aren't you still under the same umbrella if you're reporting to the same board?
We're reporting to the same board, but our investigations would not be, because we're essentially in the same department. We're just divisions in the same department.
Okay.
So, for example, if you had audit, let's say, for example, under the IG, and they were doing an audit, you're essentially doing an investigation of your own department. no matter how you look at it, you're still under the same department. Now, the reporting structure of reporting to the board, that has no basis on the investigations. We're still reporting to the board because the board is who the, the ethics officer and the IG would report directly up to.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to page 9, the budgetary and administrative challenges. You said said tedious and difficult. Expenses were coded wrong due to the structure, but it's not the fault of anyone. That last clause, I do think it's the fault of somebody. I'm just trying to figure out who. Is it an accounting function? Is it a finance function? Because aren't you your separate? Don't they have their own account strings, or do they not? And is that the solution for this problem? I'm looking for alternative solutions to make sure we exhaust all possibilities before going to the really, dramatic change. So I don't know, CFO Bala, that you want to respond to that.
Hamid Bala, Chief Financial Officer, and we have Deputy CFO Wilson here as well. But there are two separate divisions within an org structure, right? They're budgeted in the beginning of the year in those two separate divisions.
Okay.
The limitations become under our budgeting kind of triggers happen at the roll-up level, right? So if one person was to overspend on their budget, it could impact the other side of the house. Same thing with personnel, right? If one person overhires or has higher personnel spending, it could mitigate the other side of the house when you're two divisions under one
Okay.
org structure.
So in the instance where expenses have been coded to the wrong, incorrectly, or it's tedious and difficult,
Yeah,
isn't that a process?
that would be a process thing, and to the extent that there was anything coded wrong, those could be mitigated and fixed easily, right? So if you had a personnel that was coded in the wrong division, you can easily do that administratively.
Okay.
Change that person back out.
And is the coding of those, I know I'm getting really into the weeds here.
Sure.
Coding of those expenses, does that occur within the division, or does it occur in your shop?
We see it during the budget time, but we have coordination with the division that then fine tunes and tells us, no, this should be here, that should be here. This line item is coming off this year. We need additional budget for these specific purposes. And through that mutual coordination, we align it where it needs to be.
And I've only got 2 left. On page 10, the jurisdictional authority and collaboration, the columns, this is really helpful. Is this what exists today, or what would be in effect post legislation?
This is what exists today.
Okay, all right. That's helpful. And then I guess finally, the other potential path aside from separating y'all would be more clear SOPs, in my opinion, some standard operating procedures around, and bumper guards and limits. And do you feel like y'all have kind of exhausted that path, and you still feel like the best opportunity is to separate you out for the organizational structure change?
So, from the onset, we would engage in quarterly meetings with audit in terms of just reviewing matters, and we've done that in the past, but I still believe that separation is best.
I'm being tough on you. I support
understand.
this.
Yes.
But I want to make sure that we basically have looked at it from every single angle in terms of other potential solutions that resolve the conflict or the friction before taking what I think is a pretty dramatic step. But all that said, I am. You probably were like, well, he's not going to support this. No, I am actually supportive of it. I just want us to make sure we've thought through this.
Understand.
And it does sound like y'all have. So, other questions? And Ms. Robinson has shared with us her opinion, the law's opinion about there's no concern legally on the proposed legislation as it stands with this component in it, correct?
That's correct. The legislation that is before the Finance Executive Committee has been reviewed by law, and their law has no concerns. No.
Thank you. Other questions from my colleagues on this or follow-up comments? No? Okay. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Singo. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, next up, we're going to have Shannon Manigault come up, the Inspector General, to talk about, now this, just as she's walking up, these proposed or asks are not included in the current legislation. So procedurally, just know that we will hear this, we'll get a chance to ask questions, but if we want to affect any of this, we'll have to have a substitute crafted and brought in at the next committee meeting in order to affect these pieces, or any or all, but just want to make sure that y'all, everybody was aware about that. So, all right, Mr. Manigault, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Good morning. We're actually going to start with this presentation includes both the changes that are being proposed by the Governing Board and that of the Office of Inspector General, Compliance and Independent Procurement Review. So we're going to start with Chair Hines.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Chairman Wan, President Shipman, and our council members. Especially thank you, council members Shook and Overstreet, because yes, I was part of that 2019 of us trying to come up with a piece of legislation. So I've been here since the beginning. This legislation is in 2 years of working. I'm excited to be the chair that actually hired our first Inspector General. Oh, by the way, sorry, I am Nicola Hines, the chairwoman for the governing board of the Office of Inspector General. So we've seen it from the board perspective of, some of the challenges. We've heard from both division heads of the challenges that they face or see that what can strengthen the overall legislation to make it sure it's a better piece of legislation for the city overall. I know, Chairman Wan, you always like about the perception and stuff, but I do believe that things that we set up today is to make it better for the future. As we stated, all of us are not going to be here 5-10 years from now in these positions, but we want to make sure that we have something in place that when I'm not chair, the next chair has something that's a solid ground. And they might have some changes later on. I only got 2 more years, so. But they might have some more changes. So we wanted to kind of present some more changes before we go into changing the charter for one aspect of this governing board. As you can see up here, this is the current OIG structure. I do appreciate President Shipman to saying how to have one board. We do feel that we can oversee both departments. We oversee directly the Inspector General and the Ethics Office. We are responsible for hiring, merit raises, firing, whatever, in terms of those 2 positions. Moving on. I'm just going to give you a brief overview for those who are watching. The governing board. The governing board is to ensure independence of the Inspector General, established in Article 8. We, among other duties, we are also oversee appeals, motions to squash any OIG issues. That's kind of our structure. There are 9 members of our board. We are all volunteers. We do not get paid to sit on this board. And we range from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, Atlanta Bar Association, Atlanta Business League, the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board, Gate City Bar Association, Georgia Society of Certified Public Accountants, Legal Women Voters of Atlanta Fulton County, Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, and the 7 major universities. So as you can see, we all come from different backgrounds, and I believe at this moment, I've been on this board now a little bit over 5 or 6 years, that this is really a great board, and the way it is structured in terms of who's on the board, where their perspectives come, because we have like 3 lawyers, we have accountants, so everyone has a different perspective when we actually govern. Now into the proposed changes that I have. Or not myself, but the board. We do meet together and talk. So as we've been working through the last 2 years and working through the structure, when it comes to the governing board and the oversight, there seems to be a little bit of a lag. And so I kind of outlined in what sections in the current legislation that there really is no oversight. In terms of the board would like to be listed as parties in the final decisions. We currently, based off the legislation, we get no final decisions. So we don't know what happened. I mean, they do give us an overview view when we meet as a board member, but we don't know how many have been closed, how many, what was the final decision, if something has become, if someone was fined, not fined, or whatever. So we are asking that we are added to that list so that we can have some oversight of what's going on. Once again, as a governing board, we want to make sure that there's no overreach. The next is adding the oversight and notification to the board and irregularities noted to the independent procurement, which is section 8-106. Same thing. It's just kind of adding us to that list of when they give these notifications. Currently, how it's written, we don't get any of this information, but we're supposed to govern. We're also supposed to oversee their performance, both the Inspector General and the Ethics Office, but we cannot evaluate their job performance if we don't know what they're doing. Next is adding the board to the list of receiving parties of investigation reports from compliance. Once again, same thing. These are all different sections in the legislation, so that is in also 8-106B7. And it's just notifying the subject of reporting along with the Governing Board of Office Inspector General of the completion of the investigation. Once again, these three here are for us to kind of make sure that there's no overreach in terms of either office when you come and think of someone. Today, Inspector General, the Ethics Office, and myself have a great relationship, but like I said, moving forward, if it's not required for procurement or compliance or the Ethics Office to give us any final investigation decisions, technically, as the chair or the board, we have no idea what they're doing day to day. So we're just asking for the committee to kind of add those words to make sure that we get at least the reports. Next is add the board to the list of receiving parties for the report of recommendations from compliance. In section 8-106B9, issuing reports which provide recommended standards of practice of applicable departments, offices, and boards of city government following the determination of the city auditor of deficiency. A copy of reports issued under this section shall be provided to the governing board of the Office Inspector General. Once again, it's just a little changing of that wording of we get these reports too. Everyone else gets it, but the board who actually oversees these offices don't receive it. Adding the board of the list of the receiving parties for the independent procurement review report. You know, it's all these little different sections. So this is actually 8-107A. The biggest change that we have is we would like to establish subcommittees to the audit of the 3 OIG divisions, or if it's going to be 2 IG divisions and 1 department. As a board, we thought that this might be very helpful. As I stated, we have 9 members, but each division does something differently. And even though in our bylaws, we do talk about having subdivisions where we can meet on a monthly basis, or how the subcommittees see fit, to sit down and just kind of have one-on-one conversations with each division and kind of talk about their day-to-day. Because one of the main things is that once again, we're responsible for their performance. And so we have it in our bylaws, but the bylaws is at the bottom of the list of governance, right? The legislation is the top part. So we would like to add what we have in our bylaws into the legislation. So moving forward, there is some checks and balances that they meet. It could be an office meet with 3 people, and they just sit with the IG, just to kind of talk about what they're doing day to day, what they're doing month to month. And the same thing with the ethics office or compliance and IPRO, that's the situation. So that's where we wanted, this is a new position that we would like to add as section 8-103. And the other change that we would like to have is section 8-104B7, which talks about the nominating person from the 7 major universities. Now, I'm going to attest to this. When the person who was nominated to this position, which is the immediate past chair, was actually nominated by the 7 major universities. The way it's written now, all 7 presidents have to either agree or at least make a vote, and the majority of them then can take the nomination. When she rolled off the board, we were just getting into, I think she rolled off in 19, then obviously COVID hit, and trying to track down all 7 presidents, get on their calendar, getting them to vote. I had a new president who was like, well, I didn't know anything about this. I'm gonna put up my new person, so we had to start thing all over again, but really, it's really the majority, because once the majority is hit, that is the person who's nominated. I just want to make this kind of easier for that position on the board, is that saying that once we hit the majority of the approval process for their nomination to be put up, that we can continue to move on. It took almost a year to just get the one nominee, just because, once again, I know we've all dealt with presidents of universities, is tracking them down, finding their executive assistant, get them on the calendar, then kind of try to bring them all together. So this section here, which is 8-074, like I said, we're just asking for the majority vote so that we can stop once we get the majority. So once we know we hit 4, or, good luck, we can get 5 or 7 in timely, but once we hit 4, we don't have to keep dragging on to get the nomination, because once that person rolls off, that's going to be the process, that we have to contact all 7 have to vote. Regardless if it's 7-0, if it's 4-3, 5-2, but we have to, currently, the way it's written, that all 7 of them have to vote. And that's the end of my suggestions in terms of the board. I'm open to any questions.
Yeah, Councilmember Overstreet.
Thank you, Chair Hines. So I've not discussed this with you yet, so I do want to meet with you before we make a final decision for the body, and I just wanted to tell you that. But, thank you for those details. Clear perspective, so I appreciate that, but I'm not sure if I have questions yet. I'm going to read
Okay.
through it and sit with you.
Okay,
first,
yes, no problem. We can connect with that.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Councilmember, President Shipman, and then Councilmember Dozier.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a couple of more detailed questions. On the receiving parties and investigative reports, can you talk a little bit about the level of information that's being asked for there? Is it summary? Is it specific? What do you envision?
Well, the way the legislation is written now, if you are an investigated party and the investigation's over, you will get the report. The board does not get the report. So right now, we get an overview. When we do meet from the board and we do our monthly meetings, we have an overview. We don't get the final report that is public knowledge, but the board should be getting it at the same time as the person, as it's being closed, is what we're asking for, so that we have time to actually read through the report, have our questions that we can ask. Because once again, once it's closed, it is now public, knowledge. It's, you can ask for it for Open Records Act. But we don't get that. So as a board, we feel like we shouldn't have to request the Open Records Act because we're the governing board to kind of see what they're doing. So we're just saying, when you hand that report to the person who's being investigated, send one to the board too.
And then I want to ask a little bit about the audit committees. Talk a little bit more about what you expect them to do. You expect them
Subcommittees?
The subcommittees, yeah. Do you expect them to be advisory? Do you expect them to actually be playing an oversight role on each of the 3 areas? Talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. So what we were thinking of is these subcommittees, because of they would not be a quorum of a full board. Each member will choose which division they want to oversee, but more of a not advisory, because obviously we're not. All of us are not lawyers, but kind of just more of an oversight, kind of check in, talk through their workflow, their work process. Is there any personnel issues that we should be aware of? Things like that, so that we can be prepared. And then the subcommittees will come back and provide their report to the full board to say, hey, this month I did meet with, the compliance department and, they're working XYZ, and give us a summary of what's going on with that office. Because once again, on an annual basis, we do look, as the board, we do look at our Inspector General and our ethics officer and try to evaluate their performance. So that's also part of performance. I come from, a large corporate background, and you normally have check-in points, right? When you're trying to say, should you get a merit raise? Should you not get a merit raise? Should you get promoted? Should you not get promoted? You need to look at the holistic approach of the office. Are you a good leader in your office? Are you managing your time efficiently? We do get the budget, so we do ask budget questions during our sessions, but those are the questions that we should be asking and can see. So that's what the subcommittees are really going to be doing, so that we can kind of have a summary of what's going on in each office on a day-to-day basis.
And just as a follow-up, currently under your structure, How do you evaluate the discretion that's being used? Obviously, both of these offices have a great degree of discretion, and there are some changes that are being proposed that actually would even give them broader discretion, right? And currently, what are the mechanisms by which the board evaluates the use of that discretion by the leaders?
I will say, when it comes to discretion, obviously, we do try to make sure that we're not doing anything that would jeopardize open records or anything from that perspective. We do, like I said, we do ask them to just give us a summary of what's going on in the office. And they've both been compliant, at least giving us that piece of information so that we know, hey, they've had, I would say the disclosure, financial disclosure forms, right? They'll say, hey, we had a 93% return rate. And, we might ask questions of how many were late or how many, are still pending. So they do give us that type of information. So they still kind of work in their silos so that way they can do their job. And then instead, as the board, we kind of get some of the summary information. I hope that answers your question.
And how often do you get that summary information right now?
Currently, we are set up from our bylaws that we meet on an administrative basis every other month. And we kind of put in our new bylaws that the opposite months are appeals because we didn't know how this legislation was going to work. If all of a sudden we were going to get 50 appeals and then we will be at a board meeting for 5 hours. Because like I said, I've sat on this board before and I have seen 20 people sit in our board meeting, especially when it's financial disclosure time, of appealing their case. I will say that the ethics office has done a great job of handling a lot of their cases so that we don't get that many appeals. So we'll probably, we have a lot of new board members, so we'll be looking at our bylaws differently again to kind of see how we'll restructure our meetings. But right now, we get them every other month.
So I just want to make one final comment. I do think, especially given some of the proposals that are here around the expanded, I think, what I would call the expanded authority of the offices to initiate. I do think that board oversight is very, very important. And I think more often and more specialized board oversight is very, very important because if you're a 9-person board, you got 3 different areas, very likely that the board's not going to become an expert in the ethics side or in the procurement side, right? It's going to stay at a high level. Whereas if you have these specialized subcommittees like you're proposing, I think you will get much better discussion and much better oversight because those folks will become specialists over time and they'll really know the ethics and they'll know when something has changed, right? So the spirit of this, I think, is right. The one sort of question I would ask, just from a board perspective, is do you want only certain members on one topic? So you could imagine, because this is a non-voting situation, these subcommittees, that you might do 4, 4, and 4. That way you have a small number of board members that are on 2 of these subcommittees. Okay. And therefore they can do compare contrast, right? Because right now you're going to get deep specialization, but nobody's going to be able to say, hey, I saw this other thing that procurement's doing and it's a really cool thing and we ought to ask the same question in ethics. You're not going to get that cross-pollination. So just, we've all served on lots of boards, but often when a board has some degree of board overlap between these kinds of topics, they'll get a better outcome. So it's a little bit more of a burden. I get why you do 3, 3, and 3. It's very convenient, but I would offer that that might be a better oversight.
Okay, strategy. I definitely appreciate that. I just took a note to kind of maybe amend that to kind of say that it's 4 members per subcommittee.
Thank you, Chair Juan. I just had a quick question about the universities, those bodies that were selected. Any insight on how y'all or how it was determined that those specific 7 universities and colleges were selected as opposed to like Atlanta Technical College or Metropolitan State or ITC?
Honestly, I don't know. Outside of the certified fraud and the accounting, because we were a board of 7. Those are the 2 new ones based off of, we used to have the compliance department. Those were 2 new ones that kind of help with the oversight. I'm not sure how the other 6, I don't know. Oh.
Phoenix and City Attorney, back when Shirley Franklin was elected, she created a body to look at the ethics code and the structure at that time. And so it was the recommendation of that group I don't know what the rationale was, but it was a recommendation of that group, that this particular group of universities be selected. And just so we don't lose the point, with that, the law eventually was refined, or there was a subsequent decision made by state court indicating that while these entities can be members, and decide on their representative, ultimately, it couldn't be fully delegated. At one point, it was fully delegated to those entities to determine who would sit on the board. The decision coming out of DeKalb County, which affects us, is now they can make the recommendation, but ultimately it is the decision of the governing authority to determine who would be the board member. Okay.
And what kind of, why that got called out for me is it says the 7 universities versus the 7, or some, I just was curious, like, where that definition was referenced, and if there's opportunities to, the landscape is changing in the city. We're growing our technical schools, and just thinking about where there's opportunity for those entities to get involved in processes like this. I think it's worth consideration. That was it. Thank you.
Else? I have a question for you. I'm going to be just as tough on you on this.
No problem.
A lot of what I feel like you're asking for are governance issues. And so I'm just of the personal ilk that I'm reluctant to codify what I feel like your board can handle in your bylaws. You have the authority to create your bylaws, all the reporting, all the formation. I just don't know that there's an instance where we've gone so far as created a board or commission and then said you must form 3 subcommittees and they must have all these functions. Have you run into resistance in terms of your board trying to affect these changes? Or is there another reason why you're asking it to be in the charter?
Well, like I said, it's not resistance because they have given us overview summaries. But as you know, like the legislation is the law, and so then the bylaws is subsequent of the legislation. We can submit our bylaws of how we govern our board, but we can't not require the Inspector General or the Ethics Office to give us reports because of how this legislation is written. They can't give us the detailed reports because the way it's written, we don't get the detailed reports. We get the overview summary, and that's all we get. And that's kind of like what the law states right now is it stops with the person who's investigated. It does not say the report also goes to the board. So, yes, I can probably ask Ms. Sangova or Ms. Manigault, can you, send the board the report? But once again, like looking at the legislation, technically, they don't have to, which, obviously will open a whole nother realm of other issues, but we rather say, hey, if it's the legislation and it's the law that you have to give the governing board the final report, that is kind of would be the hierarchy in terms of ranking.
I'm going to ask Ms. Robinson this question, but if in their bylaws, they're the governing board over the 2 offices, if they mandate it via their bylaws, they can require it, correct? Or am I?
That's right. If the board were to request that the Inspector General or the Ethics Officer to provide them with more detailed reports, you would be entitled to receive those reports from that office. The offices report to the governing board. So regardless of whether or not it's stated in the charter that it's mandated, the board has the ability to request those reports in any detail that the board would require. And those offices would be expected to comply with that, as you all are the hiring and firing authority over those offices.
Right. And like I said, I just kind of want to make sure from a hierarchy that is there in place. Like I said, right now, today, there is, I don't see a concern today, right? I could go back and say, hey, send us all the reports for the month of February or whatever you close from January and February. But, like I said, if I'm reading it from someone who's new on the board, that would be something that would say, this is the law, and then this is the bylaws. It's the, and I could be wrong of how that works, but if this is the law and it states in the law that technically they don't have to, even though we're the bylaws, we are the governing board and we're asking for them. But if a new person read that, and as I stated, we do have 3 lawyers on the board that also read it the same way, that technically they do not have to. And like I said, then that opens down a longer road for us to kind of have that discussion. So as I said, discussing it with the 3 lawyers on our board, we did definitely see that we wanted that oversight in there in terms of making sure we got the reports.
I appreciate that approach. I guess I actually think there's more power in your governing board bylaws than you might think. And that, to me, the downside of it is that every time we come and do this, it's a charter amendment, and it's a long and involved process, and you're going to have to go through this every single time. The bylaws are far more nimble, and they are, in my opinion, binding because, again, if you were just an ancillary board, that's one thing, but you are the governing board of these 2 offices. You are the final authority. And, I mean, I'm nervous about the Pandora's box, that if we start doing this, then the other boards are going to see us like, oh, I guess we need to do it too, when we had already the default in place in terms of bylaws and standard operating procedures. So while I don't object to what you're asking for, I just feel like there's a more efficient way that gives y'all continued nimbleness and flexibility. The committees. I mean, y'all could decide tomorrow you want 4 committees, or you want to, and the bylaws will let you do that without you having to come back
Right.
to us for 3.
Yeah, and I understand that part. So the bylaws, how we look at the bylaws is how we as a board come together. We do put in there, making sure that you nominate your chair, make sure you, how we meet. We do put all that in how we work as a functioning document, and we do change it if, see fit. Obviously, when we changed into the governing board of the Office of Inspector General, outside of the ethics board, we made a lot of significant changes to our bylaws because of those changes to make sure that we're functioning as a board. But that's the bylaws, is the bylaws for the board, the governing board. And yes, we can say in the legislation, let's have subcommittees for each division, but we can change in our bylaws to say, hey, you know what, we can frequently change, because today we might have 9, you guys might say you want to extend it to 11, but we can then change the bylaws to say, okay, every subcommittee now has 5. That's kind of how we, we can function as a board. But one of the functionalities that we see here is that also, just as President Shipman said about being experts, right? So another thing could be like, we don't put in the bylaws anything about subcommittees, and then we lose that expertise as you move forward. I do stand from a space of, how can I make this better for tomorrow? And by saying, hey, let's go ahead and put in there that there are subcommittees overseeing the divisions, we can add the bylaws of the suggestion of saying it's 4 people per subdivision. Or we might say, hey, it's 3 people. Or we could put in our bylaws that it's 1 lawyer per subcommittee, so that we have a legal person on the team. We can change that into our bylaws on a regular basis, but I do feel like something like that, a subcommittee, needs to be in stone, that this helps us become a better board to understand what we're governing. I've been on the board for a long time, so yes, I understand the ethics code and stuff, and, caught up to speed for the IG. But once again, I'm what I call a layman. I'm not a lawyer, so it's, it's something there to say we will have these expertise people who can really speak on these divisions.
All right. Just know that that'll be the lens that I look at as this proposal moves forward. I do want to add to Councilmember Dozier's point. I mean, if we are going to open up that conversation regarding the methodology in which the colleges and universities appoint, I do think we should look at the composition. Atlanta Technical College comes to mind. They're such a key partner of ours. Why wouldn't they be on this list? But
Yeah, and our thing is like, as long as you put the majority, because
I got you.
you
No,
don't,
I got you.
you don't have to track down 10 university
Yep.
presidents.
Yep.
So
Other
it's a big
questions or comments? Mr. Shook, and then Mr. Winston.
Yeah, before we, kind of move on, I just want to make sure I'm very clear that your board is merely asking to be copied on findings and other reports,
Yes.
not to take any supplemental or
Nope.
separate action.
Nope, just anything that would be considered a public record once it's closed. And we're just saying, just include us in that wording to say, when you give it to the, I believe one of the wordings is that the person who investigates the final report, that also that final report comes to the board.
Winston.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Chair Wan's point. It seems like, if we start getting into some of the weeds in terms of the function of the governing board, then you sort of lose your independence as we keep getting involved in that. And so it seems as though I agree with the point that it seems like these are bylaw changes that would happen within the board actually self-governing, coming up with their own rules that would be flexible in terms of you all being nimble if you needed to change those going forward. And so I just wanted to add to that point that I just think it's important to keep the independence of.
And I just want to say, yes, we do, like I said, we do work on our bylaws, and the bylaws is to help us govern as a group and work as a team to kind of build those bylaws up to make sure that it's a functioning document. It can change yearly, it can change, 6 months, we can bring it up, for vote to change the bylaws. What it's saying is that, there was, I know with the new changes of this legislation, we did have a lot more oversight. Like, we did see a lot more cases. We knew exactly what was going on. And I do know legally we had to change some of those procedures because of Open Records Act and things like that of, asking for subpoenas and things in front of an open board. But because of those changes, technically the oversight of the board kind of got a little bit weaker. If you think about hierarchies and stuff like that, and if you, take the chair as kind of a CEO, things always kind of come up to that top part. And the way it's written now, it's not written that stuff flows up. It kind of stops here. And so then it's now having the board have to automatically ask, like all the time, like, hey, it needs to come to us, or we're asking you to come to us. The bylaws is for the governing board. It's for us to function. If you read it and how it's written, it's not really for the office. Like that's what the legislation is for, is to design how the office functions. And that's what we're just asking and saying to make sure to add that as the part of the function of the office, that the function of the office is to make sure that they always copy the governing board, regardless.
Yeah, I think there's things that we could help in terms of framework, but I think once we start getting to very specifics, then.
And like I said, it's just those certain, I think there's 5 sections that we're just saying, and governing board, and that's really all we're asking for, and the governing board, because like I said, it stops at the person who's being investigated.
Okay, point taken. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
President.
Just a question for Law Department. If there was a blanket statement in the code that said, we're not in conflict with the code, the governing, the bylaws would be a requirement of the department leaders. Is there some way that could be crafted that in essence, instead of the code being silent and thus the bylaws fill in, to give some teeth to the bylaws? Because I understand the point, right? If you have an executive that doesn't want to do it, the only recourse the board has is a 2/3 vote to remove the leader, right? Which is fine. But that's a pretty blunt instrument when you're trying to get a report, right? To say either we're going to fire you, you give us a report. Whereas to say, hey, there is in fact a duty of the leaders of these areas to abide by the bylaws of the board.
I would actually be reluctant to include language such as that in the charter because the bylaws govern the board generally. They vote for them, they vote themselves, and they govern the board. Whilst there are portions, as we're discussing here, where it would be completely reasonable and frankly, I would argue already required if the board were to ask for certain reports that are as stated public records that they would receive them under frankly state law. But there are certain things that the board could include in bylaws that employees of the city could not be subject to. And if we were to state in the charter that employees of the city of Atlanta are subject to certain rules or guidelines or what have you that might end up in a board's bylaws, we could have conflicts with either state, federal law, or the city code. So I would be reluctant to say something blanket like that.
Thanks. So I think that's the issue, right? So the issue is fundamentally we've kind of got square peg round hole. The board governance document is really for the board. You're trying to get, in essence, the leaders to do certain things, but that may or may not be comport with other kinds of law. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, Ms. Emerson.
I do want to just be clear, though. I mean, in this notion of provision of reports, if there are reports that exist, all of us and everybody is entitled to them on completion. They're public records. So the state law already requires that all you have to do is ask, regardless of the fact that they actually report to you and therefore would be subject to your direction. As a hiring and firing authority, I do understand that that can be seen as a blunt instrument, but it is how all employees are, expected to comply with the assignments that they're given in our current employment structure. So there is no legal reason why you couldn't have what it is you're asking for at this point.
And I'm saying, I would say this, it's no legal reason. Yes, I could fill out the Open Records Act and say, hey, I want every single closed case from the ethics office from date to date, like anybody else in the city of Atlanta, any employee, whatever anybody wants. I think what we're saying as a board is that as the governing board, to have to do all these loops to get something that we should already have, and as President Shipman stated, the way we could say, yeah, we put in the bylaws, you have to give us the report or else. That's kind of like how it is, right now, because the law is that they don't have to, but the consequences is there. So of course, if you don't want the consequence, you're going to comply to our request. We're just saying that as the board, that we don't see why, if you are getting investigated, you get the report, but the board does not get the report. We're just saying that that doesn't make, logical sense, that it's not automatically sent to the board also. If it's already written that the investigated gets the report, it should be automatically that the board gets the report.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, when requesting anything, there's no magic form, there's no, it truly is just a request. In my opinion, all you would have to do is ask for these in an email or something informal for it to be provided. There's not like a process to send in an Open Records Act request that, everybody is required to comply with. There isn't any process.
You also got to realize that 9 of us are full-time employees or entrepreneurs that are not getting paid to do this. So even the one simple request, is, it is more of like, okay, now I have to do an administrative task.
I think what I'm saying is I think it would, from a legal standpoint, you would be entitled to say to your various reporting officers that I would like this information provided to me upon publication always moving forward. You wouldn't have to do it for each one. And then they would be entitled, they would be, required to do that. You are the governing board. They report to you.
Right, so that would be, so just to I'm just asking, this is my question if you don't mind me asking. So the 9 people would have to individually, or as me as the chair would have to do that?
If the board empowered you to do that as chair, then you could do that as chair.
And then when I'm not chair, then I have to pass that on to the next person to let them know that they have to request this. I'm just saying, this is.
I think that, once the once that administrative process is established, then it would be reasonable to expect that even with a change of chair, that the process would continue. We all, except for our elected officials, report to somebody. And it's understood that once our appointing authority has instructed us to do something, that we're required to do it. And it doesn't matter that it's not in the charter or the code.
And I'm just saying, because now you're saying too that we're assuming that the next IG or the next ethics officer or the next chair is going to follow what was placed in 2022. And that's what I'm kind of getting at. That's like, we want to kind of not have the assumptions, right? It's required, so that way, regardless of who's in these 3 seats, the IG, the ethics, and the board, don't have to say, hey, well, how did you handle this? How did you do this? And like I said, I've been a chair for a couple years, and there's been things that I've had to go back to the past immediate chair and say, hey, how did this happen? How did this go? And stuff like that. And so that is kind of the stuff that I'm also trying to eliminate, the headaches of running a board on top of just, like I said, having that oversight.
I appreciate if this comes forward in legislation to us, we can kind of continue this conversation. I think we've heard all sides. Councilmember Overstreet.
Chair Hines, quick question. So are there any parts of what you're proposing that you would have brought before council had this charter not been opened up. Like, whereas right now we're standing in a position, a posture where we're open to changing our IG and the Office of Inspector General, where and we wouldn't have been had not ethics want to stand alone. And are you here because this opportunity is before you, or would you have done this regardless?
It would have been done regardless. We all three, ethics, IG, and myself as overseeing the board, have had separate conversations about the changes. We allowed 1 year to go through and kind of said, okay, we've had a full year, 2021, we worked it, we saw it, and then as 2022 came about, we started making different changes. Currently, like my board had changed a couple of times in terms of the board members. And so it started and stopped because board members, switched out. And so finally it was like, you know what, I got to put this as top priority right now. And so then I, sent it out to the board. We actually collected also different documents of other ethics, other governing boards and how they work and function so we can kind of have some background. So we've been working on this for past year. It just kind of got pushed to top of the level once we found out the amendment was there, and we're just like, oh, let's, and so I sent it back out, and two of the lawyers on the board kind of read through it, did the wording, put the suggestions together for the board, and we was like, let's bring this forward.
Because from what I'm hearing today, it sounds like there may be a couple things that we could actually, change, codify, incorporate into the charter. But there may be a couple things that can actually be done via bylaw changes. So, when we meet, I would have gone through extensively, better than I have today anyway, your proposed changes, and I'll have more questions then to figure out, which category they will go in.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Manigault, we're going to bring you back up. And I think, given kind of how comprehensive everything is, I think we'll go through each one of the sections and then stop for questions.
Okay, so you want to take section breaks?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
that might be the better, because you've done it kind of topically, and I think that's a
Yes.
good way of just breaking this down. So let's try. I'm just minding our time. It is 10:15, and I know some council members have some hard stops, so I want to try and get.
Great. Thank you very much. I also want to be mindful of time. As you see, there's quite a bit before you. And let me say from the outset that I saw, as soon as it was clear that there was going to be a work session, I saw this as the first conversation of hopefully many. I hope to have individual conversations with each of you to talk through anything, because there is quite a bit there, both in the presentation, but then also in giving you background information, because I'd like the decision-making to be as informed as possible, so that sets a foundation for the discussions. From the beginning, I guess I'd like to say a word of thanks, first for holding this work session where we can talk about these issues, but also for the legislation as it stands now. So particularly for Councilmember Shook and Councilmember Overstreet, and for Ms. Robinson, the revisions that are being contemplated and discussed here are really enhancements to a strong foundation. And there are many aspects of the existing legislation that have been the envy of some of my peer colleague IGs from other places. What we're looking to do is build on that foundation. And that for the past 2 years, where I've been trying to build the office and specifically the compliance division, the things that I've observed with the legislation in terms of prospective improvements and making these changes, I kind of regard as important as anything else that I've done for the office. So with that, we're going to go section by section. Each of the sections are set up the same way, where we talk about why the change, and then go into some suggested language for the change. Again, these are just suggestions for now, but we've thought through how they might be amended. And then a slide that includes the model language in some instances and also examples from other jurisdictions and others. Because while I very much hope that you would take my word for some things, you don't have to take my word for it. There's a lot of precedent out there, and so we want to make sure that we're based on solid footing. So we start with access. Access is really the hallmark of IG offices. At any level of government, when you have an Office of Inspector General, having access to the direct records, whether that's a specific agency at the federal level or for the full city, this is paramount to the work. And it really sets IG offices apart from some other oversight entities that occupy this space. The revisions that we're seeking here are trying to make clear, because it already allows for access in the legislation that's out there, but we want to make clear that it's full, unrestricted, and the real change here is about direct. As much as possible, we'd like to, and again, it's not always possible, we'd like to be able to, where there are systems in place, be able to get access to those systems so that we don't have to go through individuals. There are a number of benefits to that, though the most important is preserving the integrity of any investigation. Very clearly in conducting a confidential investigation, as tight a circle as we could possibly maintain about the individuals who know about the investigation, the mere fact of the investigation, and also the details, the better. And so by having direct access, it helps do that. There are also benefits then to protecting the individual, there's the P, to protecting the individual subjects and witnesses. So, when we're looking into allegations, they are just allegations, that or whether it's something that we had initiated on our own. And so we don't want it to be the case that you have additional information out there about someone who's just the subject of an investigation where we might find that there's absolutely nothing there. It also is about the timely retrieval of information, that we're with direct access. We don't want to be in a situation where we're waiting for weeks and sometimes months for individuals to get us information, that we should be able to have it kind of instantaneously. There is unquestionably a burden that comes on staff when we're having to go through staff in order to get information, and obviously people have city jobs and the IG response might not be the highest priority. Where we can have direct access, that alleviates that. But it's also acknowledging the very real possibility that there are individuals who are looking to delay, stall, potentially impede an investigation. And so where we can have direct access, it also helps to countermand that. So here, this is some of the proposed language, and I know some of the slides, there's a lot of detail on some of these slides, but we just wanted to give the language. The important thing on this slide, as I said, it's the direct, full, unrestricted, but I also wanted to address the language that is stricken there, which is the except where confidential and privileged. It's the experience of many IG offices, it happens all the time, that there are assertions of privilege in a blanket way that are used to then stall investigations, to not provide information. And so we could spend hours talking about the specific privilege issues alone. This is clearly something that we'll kind of discuss with the law department internally. But there's guidance both at the federal level, and you'll see with the model legislation that notes that information should be given kind of notwithstanding these claims of privilege. The other aspect of the change here is that the legislation as it stands now has a little bit of what feels to me like a conflict. It starts off with a statement saying that everyone must provide access, and that's kind of unqualified. But then in the next instance, it says, well, where you don't provide access, the IG's office can issue subpoenas. This language shouldn't be necessary. It should stop at the you provide the access. And indeed, there are other jurisdictions. We cite the language in the other slide with New Orleans, where it actually comes right out and says, no subpoena shall be necessary. And it's not necessary in other jurisdictions as well. The subpoena power of these offices are used for third parties, not for the parties that are under the direct jurisdiction. And then finally, the other access issue is about vendor records. This might seem like a small detail, but as it stands now, the language in the charter requires the vendors to provide information, but only that information that goes to the compliance with the terms of the contract And while we're certainly not looking to get into any of a particular vendor's issues with any other clients or any other governmental entities, it's just clarifying the language to make sure that it's just in connection with the contract. We've already had a circumstance where we had requested and needed information from a vendor, but it didn't actually speak to the specific contract terms, and so we just want to make sure that that's not a limitation in the future. So here, definitely need my glasses for this one. I know most of them easily enough, so I can say, you can start off at the top and you can see the model municipal language. This is from the Association of Inspectors General, and where possible, I've cited to that. The Association of Inspectors General is the standard bearer for offices of Inspector General at the state and local level. They perpetuate rules and guidance and certifications in terms of professionalism of the industry, and so they're a real authority for this work. That the Office of Inspector General then also promulgates a model legislation, and the idea is that IG offices should have all of these provisions. Notably, for the AIG model legislation regarding access, it describes full and unrestricted access to the records. And at the end of that first paragraph, this power supersedes any claim of privilege. It also then talks about the IG then maintaining any confidentiality of public records, and I think that's part of how the kind of privilege covers over. For Philadelphia, and again, I've selected cities here, there are roughly 15 municipal IGs. I've selected some cities that have good, robust legislation and also well-established office. You can kind of pick and choose from various jurisdictions, but I included the full sets of enabling legislation for the cities in your binders. For Philadelphia, it describes full, free, and unrestricted access. In New Orleans, it describes access to the records, anything deemed necessary to facilitate an investigation, and then goes on to say, this is New Orleans again, the no subpoenas required. And then in New York, the language is, shall be informed of and have unrestricted access to meetings, et cetera, and to all records maintained by each agency. So that's it for access. One down.
That's it for access. All right. I'll entertain this. These are big asks, so let's entertain questions.
Yep.
If I'll go ahead and start, and then so with regard the striking of the privilege concerns me. And let me ask first. And I don't know if this is a you question or a law question. Right now, are there remedies for investigations that can challenge privilege? You said in your remarks that there can be instances where privilege is, I'm not going to say abused, but it is incorrectly applied to withholding data. What are the existing remedies that would be available to challenge and essentially negate and retrieve those that were incorrectly deemed privileged? I don't know if that's a law question or if that's a... I'll let you start, yeah.
So in the first instance, I think that's one of the things, and for all of these changes, I mean, some of the things Ms. Robinson and I have talked about these issues for hours and hours,
Sure.
Not just in connection with the work session, but even when I first started, because there were so many things that it's like, oh, I'd like to know why this and how that, and so a lot of this is the product of many conversations about this. From what I understand, the subpoena provision was designed to address that, right? To have an avenue where then you could go to court to talk about some issue if it's, you've now made this request, we've upheld information, you've now issued a subpoena for these things that are required. Ultimately, whether it's an ask and a denial or whether it's through a subpoena process, the remedy there is going to court.
Okay.
And that's the thing that has happened in other jurisdictions. There was a case in the Chicago Inspector General's office that went up to the Illinois Supreme Court, and it was regarding that city's law department's repeated blanket assertions of privilege that prevented that office from conducting investigation that was even required under a federal consent decree. So court is the remedy.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to hear there is at least a path, but because to roll back privilege protections just in a blanket way makes me very nervous. And I think it's access that I mean, I don't know of any jurisdiction or legal authority that actually can have that, even at the federal level.
At the federal level, you have comments, it's both within federal IG guidance. I found documentation from Michael Horowitz, who is the Department of Justice Inspector General, so one of the, if not the most respected federal IG, where in response to a congressional inquiry, he noted that there is no documentation that should be withheld from an IG for privilege assertions.
Okay. And I noticed in kind of your citations that this one, are there any municipalities who have actually given this access? Your citation there is just the association, or what, I can't remember, but there's not a specific city cited.
So the association is the model, and so no, there's not the,
Okay.
I think various jurisdictions have different language that is close to ours, though I will say, and this is something that we talked about various of these issues, it was something that was pointed out by the deputy ethics officer, no jurisdiction that he found or that we had found begins the provision of access with a denial, right? That the paragraph begins with excluding these things, you can have access. But there are absolutely other cities and municipalities that note that there might be some reasons where things might be withheld. But there's a broader argument about privilege, and some of that touches on the larger umbrella of, despite the fact that IGs are an independent office, they are still functioning within the broader entity, and so there's not the break of it. So like I said, the privilege thing is a much longer and detailed kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's really the crux of the ask here, though, is, I mean.
The direct is also pretty important here.
Yeah, okay. And then, where else did I want to go with this? The subpoena issue. Have there been instances where y'all have had to, in your investigations, where you've actually had to resort to that?
We have not yet had to do that.
Okay, so far, everyone has kind of complied with your investigation records requests.
Yes, though some requests have taken longer than others to have fulfilled.
Okay, so that is more of a timing issue than a ultimate resolution issue.
Well, it could be both, right? I mean, at a certain point, the delay seems like you're not going to give the records, and so then it kind of pushes a subpoena.
Yeah.
So while it has not yet happened, we're still so young in our time, and it feels like I understand your reticence to address issues that have not yet come up, but I think in part because this is brand new legislation and brand new office, this is precisely the time to address these issues that are so foreseeable, right? That this isn't speculative. These are things that are going to come up and be sources of issues. And as I said, the denial of the information, the subpoena part of it is just an intermediate step. If there's going to have to be some adjudication, there's going to be some adjudication regardless of subpoena.
Isn't another path on this, again, I keep going back to this, isn't another path just as a standard operating procedure, if a certain time period has lapsed, you automatically go to subpoena, versus waiting and playing that game? You have the remedy, so.
Yeah, I mean, in the world where we've asked and we've been put off, I don't know that issuing a subpoena is then going to affect any different result. And so if the solution there is actually, you know what, we're not going to give you this, so sue us, then it comes to that. And then there are complications with that too, right? The representation, and then often the conflict that comes up with IG asks then kind of pits the IG office against what might be a city's law department, so that means we have to get a law firm. Like it ends up being pretty fraught.
Yeah, where I struggle, I mean, is you have a remedy. What you're expressing you haven't had to resort to. You're just anticipating. One option is to essentially change your procedures in terms of when you resort to this. And these protections are in there for a reason. I mean, they are there to protect those that are being investigated. And to ask us to just blanket remove them for convenience scares me. And so I'm trying to find a compelling reason, following that logic trail, that we should say, you're right, just in case, let's go ahead and rip all these protections out so that you can do your work faster.
So the privilege issue, again, is kind of part of a broader argument as to whether the privilege is broken when something is disclosed to an Office of Inspector General. I don't know that the subpoena process then is such a kind of due process, or I don't know that that's providing that level of protection. It's certainly an administrative hurdle for our purposes, and we have a process by which we issue our subpoenas. People write individual memos to justify it. We make sure that this isn't done kind of willy-nilly, and then we issue them. But then the no will then still be the no. The process part of the subpoena is on our end, not on the recipient's.
Questions? Shook, did you have it? Yep.
Yeah, basically what he said. I'm going to start at kind of 80,000 feet, but I'm not going to get any lower than 60 to respond to this tranche. First of all, I think you're the top cop we thought we hoped we'd end up with, and good for you. And you wouldn't be doing your job if you didn't ask for completely unfettered investigative powers, which is what you're doing here. I don't know of any other way to say it. For someone who has some overripe thoughts about the power of government, I'm discomfited out of my mind about some of this, and it's going to take a lot to get me where you want me to go, because our responsibility is totally different from yours. We're the we have some check and balance boxes here that, so this is a real challenge, but thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to walk through a little bit practically. If you initiated an investigation and someone asserts their Fifth Amendment right, what happens?
They don't provide us with any information.
And what do you do? If this, sorry, let me back up. If we were to adopt this as you have outlined, so assume that this is now in code, in the charter, someone asserts their Fifth Amendment right, what happens next?
So it depends on what the investigation is. We would proceed to try to gather as much information from alternative sources as possible, which we would have done in any circumstance. So you accumulate documentary evidence, you gather testimonial evidence from other possible witnesses, and then you make a determination of the facts, whether we think that there is wrongdoing. The standard for kind of substantiation and whether then we make a referral to an administrative head for administrative wrongdoing is a kind of preponderance of the evidence. So it's more likely than not that some wrongdoing has occurred. And so then we craft a referral letter. If this is a criminal issue, which, someone taking the Fifth thinks that there's a crime here, then we take that same set of information that we would have gathered, and we would, if we think that there's criminal wrongdoing, present that information to the relevant prosecutor, depending upon the nature of the alleged criminal conduct. That could be a DA's office, it could be the Attorney General's office, or it could be the U.S. Attorney's office. And then that office makes the determination about prosecution.
I would just like to add, when dealing with employees of the city of Atlanta, or any public employees, when they're being internally investigated, employees can be compelled to give a statement regardless of their Fifth Amendment rights. If they refuse upon being compelled by their employer to give a statement, then they can be disciplined up to and including dismissal for their refusal to give a statement. Now, they may choose that for their own criminal liability purposes, that's a risk that they're willing to take. However, internal investigators can compel statements from employees. Now, those compelled statements cannot be used against those employees in any subsequent criminal prosecution. That is a principle of, it's called the Garrity rule. It is employed in internal investigations throughout the city of Atlanta. So when you have a situation where an employee asserts their Fifth Amendment rights, you can tell that employee, I'm compelling you to give a statement. They may still refuse to give a statement, but then regardless of the substantive finding of the investigation, that employee can be held to account for refusing to comply with the internal investigation as compelled by their employer.
So that exists today.
Yes,
And
that is a
and-
constitutional principle established by the Supreme Court.
And an investigation would include IG investigations, is that correct?
Yes, if an employee, that's exactly correct.
And who can compel, the IG's office or the direct supervisor of the employee?
It would be the IG's office as the investigative arm of the city of Atlanta in this particular example. But if it were your department that was
HR,
conducting an investigation, they have that ability as well as HR.
But that exists today,
Yes.
does not require what we're contemplating here?
Absolutely
Okay.
not.
So to me, non-lawyer, it sounds like that there's already a way in which you have the authority to compel a statement from someone in an investigation, irrespective of them asserting, if in the case that they assert a Fifth Amendment right. It sounds like you don't have to stop asking them questions. Is that right?
No, and the way that Ms. Robinson described it is exactly right. That's how it works with IG offices everywhere. I'd say that making the decision to compel a witness is not taken lightly, and it's done in concert with the prosecutor's office, because it means that once you do that, there goes your kind of criminal case, at least surrounding those statements. And what you're trying to do is get statements at then. So, but no, those are things that are already in place in terms of compelling a statement. These particular provisions that we're talking about in this access session are really about the retrieval of city records, separate from what an individual is stating about his or her own conduct.
So let's go to that point. If someone were to assert confidentiality or privilege today, what happens?
So if we needed information from a department and there was an assertion of, oh, no, we're not going to give this to you because it's confidential or might be privileged, that would be it, right? Our remedy is we can take the step of the subpoena, which if you've said no to the ask, I don't know why then it's magic that we've now issued a subpoena, that's suddenly going to turn into a yes. And then it's the same remedy of then going to court if we then require that that information. And that to me seems that we were talking about hammers before. That's a hammer, having to go to court every time that we want access to a city record.
Got it. So just again, to be clear, the subpoena power, in your opinion, has no real teeth in it today?
I want to be very, very clear. The subpoena power matters very much just for third parties. It's not supposed to be for city records.
I think law.
I did want to clarify that there's a process that going to court is not a requirement that upon subpoena, if there's a refusal to comply, that the very next step is you're in court. The way it should work as set forth in the charter is if there was an assertion or a refusal to provide documents based on an assertion of privilege or confidentiality as established in state law, which is the standard as set forth in the charter, and then a subpoena issued for that same information, it would be incumbent upon the department to move before the governing board of the Office of the Inspector General to quash the subpoena. And then at that point, the department or individual, I suppose, that was asserting the privilege or the confidentiality of the record would have the burden to show that the record was in fact protected in that manner. It wasn't just assertion without support. The OIG would have an opportunity to respond, the board would ultimately make a determination, and then there would be certain appeal rights from there.
But the governing board's not making a legal determination. The governing board would be making sure that the request as it's coming from the IG's office was appropriate.
Pursuant to Section 8-103, the governing board can hear appeals that may be filed from any adverse decision issued by the Office of the Inspector General or a motion to quash the subpoena issued by the Inspector General or the ethics officer.
Right. I mean, my read of that had always been that as pursuant to the board's oversight authority, it's making sure that there wasn't some overreach from the board's perspective, right? It's certainly not, as the chair said, there are some lawyers on the board, but it's not making a kind of call legally as to whether there was actually privilege.
Well, we've not, as I think, seen a proceeding before the governing board to test this, but in my opinion, the language of the section 8-103A, I mean, the hearing of a motion to quash would mean to make a decision on the motion, not to determine whether or not simply the subpoena was properly filled out or served. I mean, that can be the basis of a motion to quash, like it wasn't properly served or something like that. But I do believe that if the department filed a motion to quash and the reason for the motion to quash was the assertion of privilege, then it would be appropriate for the board to hear that and to make a determination and further process to follow thereafter. But again, this is an opinion based on my reading of the legislation and my work in helping the council craft it. We have not seen this occur to know exactly how it would actually work, but that's what I think would happen.
One more question on the suggested Article 8 updates. The one that starts with enable direct and unrestricted access to city records. Does have a page number, sorry. It talks about direct and full unrestricted access to any and all records and property in the custody of the city of Atlanta. It strikes the word public there. Can you talk about that? What exactly is being struck by striking the word public?
Yeah, you know, it's funny because given how robust the state's open records laws are, it's hard to think about what's not public, right? But there are still exceptions and exemptions to the state record, to the open records law that I think one could interpret as then meaning, okay, well, this is not then subject to public scrutiny, and so it is then not public. It's something that was generated by the city. It might have been done in the course of city business, but not public. I think the point of striking the public here was to make it clear that the access that we're requesting is not that is commensurate with Jane on the street's access as a member of the public, that there is a special access for Office of the Inspector General for all things associated with city business that are separate and apart from what anyone could just get as a matter of public record.
And what about the second clause there, in the custody of the city of Atlanta? What exactly does that mean? Is that a physical designation? Is that associated with? What does that mean?
So that's existing language.
Yeah.
And so
But it's changed now because we've gone from public in the custody of to all.
Sure. So if the same way that you would gather any city records, so things that are on city servers, things that are on city hard copy files, anything that is generated as part of the work of the city, and the striking of public is just the distinction that I just described. It's not to then say, gosh, things that would be private, so there are always laws and rules about, let's say, you work in a city facility, but you have a locker. Is there assumption of privacy then for your locker there, despite the fact that it's on city facilities? It's not like that, but it is to speak to the full access to anything that concerns the work of the city.
Okay, I'm going to pause for now.
So I was going to just back up a little bit and talk about the subpoena power. I think that the subpoena power, I don't want to minimize that at all, because I don't know, I mean, we spend an awful lot of time on that, and I just think that we can't gloss over it and make it seem like it's no big deal or whatever, because we truly it's extremely, I think it's a big proponent of your heavy hand, and I don't want to minimize that, because it is a difference in being subpoenaed and asked nicely. It's a difference. So I don't want to make it seem as if, sometimes it's okay and sometimes we don't need it. It's the fact that it's even there makes a difference. So I just want to put that there.
All right, thank you, Ms. Overstreet. Other questions or comments on the access section? Okay, let's continue on.
Okay. Complaints. So, trying to keep this fast, complaints matter so very much to any Office of Inspector General. That first bullet there about tips are the leading method of fraud detection, that is a perennial study that's done by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners looking at organizations across the world, and it's not any internal controls or other mechanisms in order to detect these issues that ends up being the leading method. No, it's complaints that are coming in. And so as part of that, what we want to do is try to make it as easy as possible for people to come forward and tell us if they suspect fraud, waste, and abuse. From my sundry conversations with Ms. Robinson on this point, I understand that the parameters were put in place for the current complaint process in the legislation, in part to make sure that people were not making baseless, frivolous complaints, and that is laudable, absolutely. But there is a balancing of priorities here, and that on balance, I think that would be particularly meaningful if, as an office, we had to investigate every complaint that came in. That is not the case. That's not the case for any Office of Inspector General. We receive complaints, we receive tips, and there's always some evaluation and assessment as to which are then going to be opened into an investigation. And so in the world where we're already making that kind of analysis, there's then less of an issue with the kind of complaints that come in that are frivolous, baseless, because we are, one, in the first instance, seeing if there's enough information to pursue. Two, in the course of our investigation, if we find that there's no there there, then the matter is closed, and then that is that. So in the tipping of scales, we really want to prioritize making it simple for people to come forward. And as it stands now, the provisions really pose a barrier. So you'll see in the actual slide with the legislation, it requires the complaints to be written, for people to know the names and addresses of the possible subjects. A lot of times people don't know those things. It requires the complaint to be sworn, and that's a real issue because people often have an idea that there is something wrong. They think that there is, I've seen this and I've seen that and I've heard this and I saw this document. But if we're suddenly asking people to swear, then the response is, well, gosh, I don't know if I can swear that there was misconduct. I think that there was something wrong here. And we don't want to deter those people from coming forward and reporting that kind of misconduct. The other aspect of the changes here is to greater empower proactive investigations. One of the key features of offices of Inspector General is that we are not looking just to identify and and have enforcement surrounding potential violations, but also as much as possible act to prevent them from beforehand. So it is standard for these offices to engage in reviews, systemic reviews of risk programs or units if there seems to be a pattern somewhere, so that it's not based on kind of reasonable suspicion of a particular individual per se, but the example is, let's say you have a major construction project. IG offices tend to estimate that in any given project, 5 to 40% of a project ends up being overcost because of fraud. 5 to 40%. So if the city had a particularly large construction project, this is the kind of provision where we want to make sure that we're enabling the IG to keep tabs on that project before the dollars go out the door, to stop that there. The idea is not to have proactive investigation of suddenly, you know what, Councilmember Juan asked me too difficult a question, so now we're going to look into him. It is not that. It is for the broader issues. It is for where we've made some assessment of risk. So yes, this is the slide that kind of details all of the hoops that individuals are called upon to jump through, and we'd like to strike those. A notable part is that anonymous complaints kind of don't have that, so there's already a kind of an odd disparity between the folks who are kind of doing these things anonymously versus someone who's coming forward and identifying themselves, and I think this would help to address that as well. And this is the proposed change with respect to the proactives. Here, again, the things that we're describing here, it's not anything magical that I'm asking. It is really kind of standard. The model legislation says that the Office of Inspector General is authorized to initiate such reviews as deemed appropriate, receive and investigate complaints from any source or upon its own initiative. The Chicago language says that the IG shall have the power to investigate either in response to complaint or on Inspectors General own initiative. The New York language says the IG is authorized is empowered to make any study or investigation, which in his or her, this charter language, so it's old, may be in the best interest of the city. And the New Orleans language also says the same. The IG is authorized to initiate such investigations as deemed credible, those complaints.
All right, questions? Councilmember Shook, then Shipman.
Yeah. So, I mean, I always enjoy seeing, what other municipalities do. I also have to be honest and say that I think a lot of people, I don't think there's a whole lot of people that would think of Chicago, New York, and New Orleans as paragons of municipal virtue. So
I think that's exactly the reason to look at how those offices crafted to address the corruption in those places.
No, I know why it's there. I'm just saying it. I kind of. So, suggested facilitation, promote proactive investigations. You want to remove supported by reasonable articulatable suspicion. And that to me sounds like you would like to be able to initiate investigations unsupported by reasonable articulable suspicions. Why remove that language?
So given the example that I gave about the kind of proactive investigation of a construction project or kind of a large dollar value project, where there is unquestionably a concern about risk, and so looking to then review the program with that in mind, I think you have to kind of contort yourself to make that into reasonable suspicion, and that's a contortion that I don't think should be necessary. I think it's some of the same thinking that underscored the creation of the Independent Procurement Review Division, right? That you have certain contracts that once you get contracts of a certain size, you want to have a proactive review to make sure that all of the rules were followed, that there was no thumb on the scale. I think that same general principle surrounding that with contracts is the kind of authority that should be seated more broadly, kind of beyond just the contract realm.
All right, I guess, and I appreciate your answer. I don't know that I'm persuaded to think otherwise. It just seems that you should have half a reason to initiate an investigation. And I don't see what's wrong with having that stated.
Yeah, and it's not willy-nilly, right? It's not
But
to
it
not
shouldn't
have.
be why is it a contortion? I guess that word bothers me.
So let's say that, the city's about to spend many millions of dollars on transportation construction costs, right? For some of those projects, if we wanted to then review the work of those vendors to make sure things are being done the way that they should, that there is not any deviation from the quality of the products that are used, that the individual labor is used in a way that it's supposed to be, the kind of that it's meeting various other kind of laws for safety and things at construction sites. All of those things, I think, would be things that are, again, traditionally done for an Office of Inspector General, but that given the current legislation, I don't know that we'd be able to do that. I mean, there's no reason for us to be looking. The reason for us to be looking is because there are historically issues with these kinds of projects. So it's not that there's no risk. There's a reason, but it just doesn't fit the narrow box of reasonable articulable suspicion.
Okay, but and I'll give up after this, but it just seems to me that you would not initiate the expenditure of your resources and time without having a reason to do so.
That's correct.
You're not going to go on a fishing trip just to see if there's a fish in the pond.
We certainly cannot afford to do any such thing, right? So the basis for doing it is because we believe that this is an area that is so ripe for fraud that is worth the dedication of those resources, that it is something that we think that there can be the savings to the city, again, before the dollars march out the door.
So why wouldn't you go about, and I'll recognize Mr. Shipman in a second, but so why wouldn't you go add that particular instance or do a carve out rather than throwing out this standard, which I think is there and should be there? Is that not another path?
Certainly. And so I want to say again, I really do hope that this isn't the last that we talk about these things. The language that's proposed here are certainly things that have been, we've been thoughtful about crafting them, but they're by no means this way or no way. And so if the thing that would make people feel comfortable is allowing other sets of circumstances and you reject the kind of own initiative that are the standards from the association and from these other places, then we can do that.
Thank you, Mr. Shipman.
Thank you. So I do notice that most of the other provisions cited from the other municipalities have some sort of clause in their, even the model legislation says as deemed appropriate. New York says in the best interest of the city. New Orleans says deemed credible. I guess my hesitation on removing of reasonable articulable suspicion or some other qualifier is if I'm on the board and I'm reviewing the Inspector General's work and I go back to this legislation, if it just says upon internal determination that a matter should be investigated or reviewed in order to detect or prevent these items, then you're justified, right? And so as a board member, the only qualification is, can you draw the line to detecting any of those things? As opposed to saying, hey, there's actually a higher standard that we, the board, hold for you, which is you have to use good judgment, back to Councilmember Shook's point. I mean, I'm not sure, to the last conversation you just had with Councilmember Shook, if you are in fact concerned about abuse, fraud, waste, that there's a contortion to say you need some sort of reasonableness. Now, perhaps reasonable articulable suspicion should be edited.
Yes.
That I can see that. But to take all qualifiers off of it actually hinders the board's ability to hold the leader, and not you at the moment, but we're talking about in general, to hold the leader to a standard of judgment.
I think the standard of reasonableness is entirely appropriate. I think reasonable articulable suspicion is something very particular, and it's not an OIG function kind of standard.
Right. So I think there may be some language, and again, it, deems credible or in the best interest of the city, but something that, again, that the board can say, hey, wait a minute, we've seen a pattern here where we don't see that sort of qualifier around judgment. I think that might be a place for an edit here.
Thank you, President Shipman. Anyone else? Mr. Winston.
Yes, to this point, I mean, I kind of am intrigued by the idea of it's almost like secret shopping or something, but where you periodically are able to review certain contracts that are at a certain level. But I'm wondering if there could be language that instead of investigated, it's more review. And then there's a trigger, for instance, a certain dollar amount. If there's a dollar amount of a certain contract, then maybe it triggers a review to just make sure that, all parties involved are being compliant in terms of dealing with all ethical rules and regulations around that. But the other side is I'm also a little concerned, like Councilmember Shook, about the unfettered, I guess, access that you would get if we were to remove the reasonable articulable suspicion. I'm open to, I guess, looking at, a review process for something that's triggered, but maybe not necessarily reviewing this language altogether. So,
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Much like the litmus tests that I've been using for the other pieces of this, remove overly burdensome administrative requirements, and then you said pose a barrier. Are you aware of folks who have not done this because this is over? And I think overly burdensome seems a bit hyperbole, but
There's a provision that makes the person cite the law that they believe is being violated. I believe that is overly burdensome. People to expect your lay person who thinks that there's fraud and waste to do some legal research, I think that that's a step pretty far.
But it says a general reference to, right? I mean, okay. To me, I don't feel like you've built a case for overly burdensome or pose a barrier.
I think the sworn piece alone is enough a deterrent to, and no, it's hard to say the negative. I don't know people who then didn't come to me, who then told me I was going to complain, but I didn't, but for the having to meet these standards. But
as you said, they can also communicate it anonymously, right?
they can. That is the least preferred way for people to provide information, where it certainly provides insulation to them, and we absolutely have to have provisions that allow for that, unquestionably. But where people tend to think that they're giving you the sun, the moon, and the stars when they leave you a voicemail saying, effectively, it's the statement that we have in our office, right? They think they've given you everything to find the fraud, where really their statement amounts to corruption is afoot. Right? There's no actual guidance as to the individuals, as to the time, as to the place. And so even in circumstances where people have provided information anonymously, where there's some way for us to get back in touch with them, we do try to do that, because there are always a host of details that are missing in order for us to actually follow through with some of the things that are said. And so I don't want the safety net of the anonymous complaint to be the driver here, because that's not the preferred way. We really do want people to be able to come to us so that we can have sufficient follow-up to get details that'll actually allow us to conduct the investigation.
But why would removing these bumper guards not increase the number that you get of very generic and general accusations if you have no parameters in terms of which, when someone should report something? Someone could just say, hey, I think Alex Wan is corrupt, and then hang up, and then...
They certainly could, and that gets filed away because we would document every single tip that we come in, but that is not going to prompt an investigation. And so that's why I was saying that the balance on high, because how could it, right? It's one thing to say, Alex Wan is corrupt, okay. If it's
Let's not try and say that on camera too many times.
The hypothetical, right? But if someone's given you need to look at Alex Wan's relationship to the vendor who he just actively promoted during FEC, notwithstanding the red flags that were in the IPRO report, that's different, right? And so you want that person who thinks that they have that information to come forward with it.
All right, thank you. Other questions, or, yeah, Ms. Overstreet?
So in that instance, that's what I'm thinking, that the whole purpose of the change in that language is to promote more involvement from the public in causing, bringing attention to things that we normally wouldn't. Is that the purpose that you think now that people are feeling, quite afraid to come forward, or just as if they are laymen, they're not equipped to do so, and you would like for that process to be a little more approachable by regular people that just really feel like they know something and want to bring it forward?
I would. I'd very much like to ease this process so that everyone, city employees, people who work for city vendors who are then on city contracts where it might be an issue, for members of the public who are consumers of city services and often witnesses to some city misconduct, you want to make it easier so that these people who are already taking time out of their day in order to do the right thing, to report some misconduct, that it is a way that is fully accessible, that we're fully approachable. Again, we want to set a low bar. And because we're not going to be investigating every odd Councilmember Juan is corrupt investigation, right? Sorry, not trying to give you this label, right? That, right, because
No, don't.
right? That because it would be different if we had to investigate all of those things. That's an entirely different calculus, because then it would be about the dedication of our resources, and so the wasted time of people just calling in with frivolous things, that would have a real impact. But we're already involving a kind of a sieve process in order to determine those things that are worth follow-up versus not. So let's make it easy enough to kind of get that information, and then we'll make the call, and then we'll make the investigation, and then it'll even be further. Where it's like, gosh, Councilmember Juan had no relationship with that vendor, so that person was mistaken. That's unsubstantiated.
Got it. Thank you.
Anything else on this section? All right, time check. It's 11:10. I know some folks have got some hard time stops. I'm wondering if I can curate a little bit and
Sure.
jump to jurisdiction. I feel like final decisions and reports, we kind of talked about a little bit, some of the changes previously. Reporting and cooperation, again, I think I want to get to the really potential hairy ones while we have the full cadre of folks up here. So if we can, does anybody have any objections to jumping to jurisdiction? Okay.
You mean just over whistleblower?
You want to talk about whistleblower?
Quickly.
Quickly, if you can.
Yeah, quick.
So the quick of the whistleblower is that right now we have a provision that is concise and does two things. It prevents people from getting in the way of someone reporting an issue to the Office of the Inspector General, and then it says, and by prevents it says you should not get in the way, and then the second part is you should not then, if you know someone has come forward, affect any reprisals or retaliation. And so what the intended revisions are planning to do is just build on that and give a little more. There's clearly a theme with the issues that we're covering here of encouraging people to report, encouraging people to come forward. And so the revisions are really about establishing this office's commitment to those people who do, should they then have any adverse effects of having done so. So where I've described the discretionary aspect of us looking into complaints, this is to establish that when it comes to an issue, an allegation that you've come forward reporting fraud, waste, and abuse, and then you were punished for it, that's an investigation separate from the underlying issue, but the retaliation alone is something we're so committed to protecting the people who come forward that it's saying we are going to investigate all of those complaints. So it's laying out that as a process. And then the other piece of it is that there's no notion of remedies in the existing, right? It says you shouldn't interfere and you shouldn't affect any reprisals, but then there's nothing to say of anything that should happen after that. And so the language here is, I think, fairly soft, right? Because as an Office of Inspector General, we're not making any decisions. We're making findings of fact. And so in the same way where we find misconduct, we then present that to a department head and have that department head make the decision. Here too, we'd be presenting our findings on the retaliation and then just noting, hey, employee, you might then seek, based on these findings, some then, kind of reparation, so the reversal of the potential adverse employment action.
Questions on this? Thank you. Yep.
Okay, so for jurisdiction, so there are 3 things that are happening with the jurisdictional revisions. The first is it's broadening based on what's here. From my various conversations with Ms. Robinson, I understand that part of the design of the jurisdiction here was to make sure, and for to be specific, this is the only slide in the presentation, the jurisdiction section, that is specific to compliance and then iPro. The other ones all apply to all 3 divisions. But for here, it's for the compliance function, that it was designed to make sure that the IG was empowered to investigate those individuals for certain conduct that had been seen or deemed beyond touch. And so you wanted to make very clear that the IG could look at these high-level individuals who before, to the extent that the investigations were internal and being conducted by the Department of Human Resources or other entities, that then might be hamstrung in having findings against some department head or an elected official, that you wanted to make sure that the office then had that capability. That's fair. So what we're looking to do is, I don't know of any other office that is limited in that way. The kind of standard language for jurisdiction for investigations is really, to the extent that we're an office that's focused on fraud, waste, and abuse, it's against any of those entities that could be perpetrating a fraud against the city. Some cities kind of consider it in terms of the city dollar. Sometimes it's about city powers, but it's really anything that kind of deals with the affairs of the city. So that is part of the expansion. And so the proposed language that are in the slides align with a number of other jurisdictions. I cited, I think, Chicago and Philadelphia for this one. So that's the kind of broader part about the jurisdiction. The second part about the jurisdiction for compliance is the seating of what is kind of in shorthand primary investigative authority with the compliance division. Here, the idea was that with the formation of the office, there was a consolidation of investigative function within the Office of the Inspector General. So that's, the ethics office with its ethics investigation, the compliance division then with its, that there were other corners of city government that had previously been conducting fraud, waste, and abuse investigations. And the thought was that with this office, that would rest in one place. The proposed revisions are designed to, even if those investigations are not still all being conducted by the compliance division, it's basically giving kind of a dual, both right of first refusal, so that the IG's office is aware of all of those instances, and where it thinks that it rises to the level that, yes, it's worth the dedication of resources, and those are matters that then the IG's office would keep. In other circumstances, then the matters could be then referred back to the individual departments. In this way, you get the benefit of having centralized, consolidated information about all of the allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse in the city. That they're not in disparate departments that are then handling them individually. Even if they then end up ultimately handled by those departments, there is still that, again, we're tracking, even if we're not looking at it, that, okay, Councilmember Juan is corrupt, yep, that's in our records. We're sending that back to Council President Shipman for investigation, and if anything comes of it, then we ask that he then report back so we have a record of that, but that is the intention there. And then the third part of the jurisdiction is about iPro. The independent procurement review provision right now has language saying that the IPRO team shall not opine on the procurement process, which seems kind of antithetical to its purpose. And indeed, to your point, Councilmember Wan, about has this happened? It has absolutely happened that the individuals for IPRO have been called upon to give their viewpoint, to explain a little bit more about some of the red flags that have been included in its reports. And so the idea here is to strike that language, not so that the IPRO team is giving the, yes, you should go forward with this contract or not go forward with this contract. That's always going to be the realm of the council, is rather that we have enough latitude to give the council as much information as possible about the findings from that solicitation and what we know about the procurement process in the aggregate, so that the council is making as informed a decision as possible.
Questions or comments for Ms. Manigal? Mr. Shook.
Yeah, so when this function was created, the council at that time was very intentional in wanting a knowledgeable set of eyes and ears to make sure that all the process steps were followed and that the scoring added up correctly. Because this was based on an audit that showed that there were all kind of problems with things as simple as the scores not adding up properly, and other kind of technical 2 + 2 = 4 type. We wanted someone to say, yeah, we checked and 2 + 2 = 4. What we really didn't want was a lot of opinion. We wanted just the facts, ma'am. So what are we missing out on?
Right. So what we're missing out on is the elaboration of some of the findings, because if that is what has prompted the office, it certainly, as part of its fulfillment of the charter mandate, as making sure that it's reviewing the full contracting file for compliance and noting other deficiencies, it's part of that noting other deficiencies portion.
But
So
give me an example of, yeah, we did all the math, they did all the math, they checked all the boxes, all the exhibits were there, but, and you need to know the but part. So what would the but be?
Sure. So one of the things that are part of the IPRO review includes bid spread. And so this is an analysis where it's checking to see that there are what the kind of differences from some of the bids that have been submitted by vendors. Our current reports note what the bid spreads are, right? So just the math calculation of what the bid spread is, because that is a red flag indicator of potential collusion. And so the reports right now are very vanilla about that. It notes just the math, but that to me should then spark some conversation about what's happening here. And as it stands now, because of this opine language, you feel a little like maybe we don't want to say too much. And in fact, when it happened, when the council was still functioning remotely, where the IPRO manager at the time was called on by a council member to, all right, so, tell me what you think about this. Tell me a little bit more about this red flag. There was a lot of hesitation, and then after a conversation with the CPO, and the CPO at the time said, oh, that person was, you were about to opine, that was about to be a charter violation, and that doesn't seem to me to serve anyone, not the council and not the public.
There's just kind of one more consideration that it needs to be recalled here. And I want to be careful about how I say this. We invented iPro to give us more information, to give us information that we didn't have. That said, we were extraordinarily concerned about lengthening what is already a notoriously long process here, and we did not want to contribute to that. And so, you've been here long enough. Things are maybe getting a little bit better, but it takes, procurement can't dance the minute waltz in under 120 days.
Right. So that's not covered with the legislation, but I would like to kind of speak to that. The way that the process is designed for iPro is that the iPro review should be running concurrently with the Department of Procurement. We have weekly meetings with the Department of Procurement, so for every project that's above $1 million, meeting that threshold, we have meetings that regularly include the deputy CPO, the CPO sometimes joins them, the procurement manager, and the individual procurement specialist on each of that, and it is to make sure that we are staying absolutely in lockstep with the process so that we are not functioning to delay in any case. When items are discussed here as, oh, it's being held for iPro, that makes it sound like, well, iPro has been slow in its review. It is not that. It is that there has not been that concurrent review that it should be. So absolutely, I think we share the priority of not extending that process any longer.
Well, I hope we amply demonstrate our reliance and esteem for iPro by automatically holding anything that doesn't have that stamp of approval.
And we appreciate that. It was not always the
Hopefully the
case.
day will never come when we weaken enough to where we are willing to send something forward on condition of receiving.
That was the case for a time, and I'm glad when there was a reversal.
I did have a question about the slide you have, provide notice to and facilitate consolidation of investigations. Would the proposed shift of the ethics office out of the OIG office impede you in any way of being able to consolidate or coordinate investigations?
No, the fact of overlap for some items that include ethics, so the same conduct that might bear out an ethics violation could then also clearly have compliance violations. The kind of featuring whether ethics was within the umbrella of the Office of the Inspector General or outside of it doesn't change that calculus.
That's good to know. I mean, I think that is a step in the right direction, or further down the right direction that y'all already started with the creation of your office. Other questions or comments on jurisdiction? Okay, I think that was the last section. If we're skipping the other two, any closing remarks from you or council members before we go to public comment?
Only that I really do. I couldn't be more sincere in saying that I hope that this is the first of the conversations, and that I really do hope to work to try. I make no promises, clearly, of being able to convince some of you of some of the provisions, but I hope to have the opportunity to work with and talk with each of you to talk through more of the questions and address the concerns, and to try to help to come up with alternative language to what's been suggested here in these slides, so that we can kind of duly accomplish the goals of kind of empowering the office to do the thing that it was created to do, but also give sufficient comfort that there's not going to be, IG's office run amok.
Other questions or comments from my colleagues before? Yeah, Mr. Shuck.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a generally shared sense of sympathy for Ms. Sangova at this point, who started this whole conversation with what now appears to be, relatively speaking, a simple ask. I think we have unfortunately done the right thing in saying, look, it's a charter amendment, it's a tough subject, we don't want to put this body and crack its chest open every 90 days because someone's come up with a new idea. But we got to wrap this up. Yeah, I personally think, there's a lot to digest, but I think we're a little bit closer now than we were at 9 o'clock, which is to say we might not all agree, and you might not like the dish the waiter brings out of the kitchen, might not be what you ordered on the menu exactly. But I think, we got to wrap this up.
Yeah, and I think what's really helpful is the fact that you've gone up and essentially done the markups that affect the things that you're asking for, that we would then either fold into the legislation that is before us that moves the ethics office out, and then fold whatever components council members want to advocate for at that point. Doesn't necessarily, maybe that's what happens this time around. It doesn't preclude us from further conversations. I would imagine that your structure is going to be one that we revisit periodically. I don't know what those intervals look like, but yeah, to the extent that we can do as much as we can this time, be good. So yeah, for us colleagues, that's kind of how I'm envisioning this, is that to the extent that we want to incorporate any changes into the legislation, we can pick that up. next cycle or the cycle after that in FEC, and then move it forward to full council for consideration. If you want to have continued conversation and dialogue with either Ms. Singova or Ms. Manigault, we can continue to do that as we make that sausage.
Yeah, and hopefully before Ms. Robinson or Ms. Overstreet or myself succumb to the PTSD that's been creeping up on us today.
But in all fairness, though, we do need to be mindful of, and that's why we started accelerating this process. There is a budget piece of this as well, so we want to be mindful of finance. That's kind of what instigated this work session. So any other comments? All right, so I'm going to open it up for public comment. I don't know if there's anyone out there who wanted to come out up and speak to this. Seeing none, with that, we stand adjourned. So thank you all very much. Okay.